Tick-tock, time to rock. Let me get a vocal check, Anthony.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Check, 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 check. All right. I'll adjust as I need to as we're going along. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Last night we were talking about our good friend Yusha Evans, and we only got through one video clip when we had 5, and we really wanted to get through his points about the Apostle Paul because they're pretty standard among Muslims and Muslim apologists. So we wanted to show how the Apostle Paul is being misrepresented by Muslim apologists, and in the case of people like Yusha Evans, they're just flat out lying, right? Like this is not in dispute. And we wanted to show how this is just acceptable in Islam. We see so many Muslim apologists doing this that we can't help but think that this is just accepted in Islam. People don't call their Muslim apologists out for saying things that are completely false. And just to give you yet another example of this, one that we've gone through numerous times. Anthony, I got to show the Yusuf Estes clip one more time, and then we'll talk about our good friend Yusha Evans. So let's have the Yusuf Estes clip one more time, just to show you how bad of a problem this is in Islam.
But I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest. This is not for you to, start a debate, but just be honest. Was Jesus a Catholic? And it's not open to debate, so there's no point in opening that up because you know and I know he wasn't. The Catholic Church was in business about 300 years before Jesus was born. It's on their website. Don't go like this. It's on their website. That's where I took it from. The Catholic Church was really started in Rome by Alexander the Great.
Now, Anthony, what's the problem with Yusuf in this clip and in the clips afterwards, where he insists that the Catholic Church was started by Alexander the Great in Rome 3 centuries before Christ? What fault could we possibly find in such a truthful statement?
Yeah. The first fault that we would find with it is that Yusuf Estes claims to have been a Christian minister, and so what he's saying should be accurate. He's also claiming that he had good reason to leave Christianity and to accept Islam, and he's talking to a group of people who are not likely to check him out. So there's a lot of issues bound up just in that. But of course, all the statements that he's making are simply false. Alexander the Great didn't go to Rome. He certainly didn't establish a Catholic Church. The Catholic Church wasn't established 300 years before Christ. And while we might debate when exactly the church in Rome could officially be considered what we would now think of as the Roman Catholic Church, the fact is that it didn't come along until centuries after Christ. Right? There were Christians in Rome from the first century. Paul writes to Roman Christians. But there was no such entity as we now know it as the Roman Catholic Church. Certainly not in terms of its distinctive or distinguishing doctrines. And he also claims, I don't know if this part of the clip was played, but he also claims that this information is verified on the official Catholic website.
And in encyclopedias.
And in encyclopedias, yeah. Right.
And all of that, of course, is complete nonsense. And I've been thinking about this with reference to Yusuf Estes and Yusha Evans and all the Muslim apologists who just make things up, because we've been talking about it a lot. But I was trying to think of what we could call it or something like that. I'm thinking of calling it the 99-1 rule, right? The 99-1 rule, namely that if you have let's say 100 people in an audience, and 99 of them don't know what you're talking about and aren't the sort of people who are going to investigate what you're talking about. But there is one person in there who is the sort of person who knows what you're talking about, knows you're wrong, or is the sort of person who, if something you say doesn't sound right, he's going to go look it up. Well, that's the perfect situation for people like Yusha Evans or Yusuf Estes. to be in, because you can say anything you want, no matter how false, as long as you're blasting Christianity or defending Islam. If 99% of the people in the room believe what you say, even though it's a lie, and only 1% of the people actually realize that what you're saying is complete nonsense, well, you win in the Islamic sense that you're building up your global mob, and they can eventually shout down any sort of 1% of the population that says otherwise, right? And why do we find this among Muslim apologists? I think it's because it's the same method that Muhammad used, right? When Muhammad said, hey, the scriptures of the Jews and Christians confirm that I'm a prophet, who's he speaking to? He's speaking to Arabs, right? They don't know what's in the Torah, and they don't know what's in the gospel. So do they know whether he's actually prophesied in the Torah and in the gospel? No, they have no idea. Let's suppose you had one person out of 99 who was like a former Jew or a former Christian or something like that, and he actually knows better. Well, if you start disagreeing with Muhammad, that's not exactly the safest place to be in among Muslims. No, Muhammad's wrong. He's not in the Bible. Oh, well, get your head chopped off, right? So this sort of 99-1 rule goes back all the way to our good friend Muhammad, and that's why you find it even today among Muslim apologists. Well, we're going to look at how this plays out in the ministry of Yusha Evans. Anthony, tell us a little bit about Yusha Evans before we go to the first clip.
Yeah, just like Yusuf Estes, Yusha Evans also claims to have been something of a minister. Typically, he'll use the phrase or something like it of being a youth minister. From his own mouth, he claims to have had a extensive background in Christianity. He was very committed. His family took him to church routinely, and he even started studying Christianity in earnest in his teen years, and so much so that he eventually thought that he would go to seminary and become a pastor. But along the way, somehow he became disenchanted with Christianity and went to a local mosque and eventually converted to Islam. Now, when we listen to Yusha's lectures and we hear him say things about Christianity, we find out that his quote-unquote extensive background in Christianity and deep search into the Bible and Christianity in general, we find that his knowledge today is abysmal, and so we can only imagine what it was at the time he decided that Christianity was no longer something he could believe in. And we have to wonder what sort of message he was hearing from the Muslims. In fact, when you were talking about the 99-1 rule, I was thinking of those people who do eventually hear accurate information that refutes what Yusuf Estes said, right? Those, or another Muslim who's purveying false information. Those people who later, let's say 3 or 4 years down the road, hear the actual facts of the case, a number of them will now have become invested in Islam for a number of reasons. And, how many of them are likely to then say, okay, well, my original reasons for leaving Christianity and becoming Muslim were not good ones. A lot of them are going to continue to stay in Islam because now they will have found other reasons that may be equally bad, but other reasons that cause them to be committed to it. And so I think the rationale there, goes pretty deep, right? You can expect to dupe a lot of people, and even those who find out later, even among those, you're going to have people that are going to stay Muslims.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen what you just talked about, that people become Muslims or believe something, and then later on they find out that it's not true, but by then it doesn't matter because they have other reasons. I've especially seen this among women converts to Islam, namely that they start talking to a Muslim man or someone else or some Muslim friends, and they tell her, hey, Muhammad was a champion of women's rights, and Muhammad was so wonderful, and the Quran is a great book for women, and blah, blah, blah. And they convert based on this. And then years later, when they've actually seen otherwise, they've learned otherwise, or they've learned that the reasons they were given for converting to Islam were all nonsense. And then you say, well, why don't you leave Islam? By then it's like, well, I've got three kids with my Muslim husband. What am I going to do? I'm going to leave the religion, and what's going to happen now? And so they have a massive psychological pressure on them to remain in line with Islam. And in the early Muslim community, and in certain places in the world today, it was even more extreme in the sense of if Muhammad came along and said, hey, I'm prophesied in the scriptures of the Jews and the Christians, and you converted to Islam, there's no checking out of that hotel, right? They would kill you. They would kill you if you left that religion once you've converted. And so once you've said, okay, I agree, it doesn't matter how false you see it as later, you will die. And so that is a tremendous incentive to stay in line once you've believed Muhammad on anything. And so that's the Islamic method since the time of Muhammad. Get people into Islam, into the fold of Islam by any means necessary, even if you have to spout complete, utter, total nonsense. Once they're in, you don't let them out. You kill them if you leave them out. That was Muhammad's method. And shouldn't be shocking today that we see something similar among Muslim apologists.
I don't know if you've heard this. I remember a Muslim imam telling a story of a Muslim who was seeking to convert a Jewish guy who also happened to be a drunkard, according to the story.
Yeah,
you heard this one?
Yeah. Go ahead. That's a good one.
So according to the story, the Muslim tells the Jewish guy, hey, look, we believe all these things. You guys believe them too. We just additionally believe in Muhammad and so on and so forth. Eventually, the Jewish guy says, well, I'm not going to convert. And the Muslim says, why? And he says, because I drink and I hear that you guys don't allow people to drink. I may be getting some details of this wrong, but the basic point I think I'll get correct. But so the Muslim tells the Jewish guy, oh no, it's okay. You can become a Muslim. You don't have to stop being a drunkard. And so the guy says, great, so I'll convert. So he says his shahada, and then the Muslim guy tells him, okay, well, I was lying. You can't drink according to Islam. If you do drink, you'll be punished.
Yeah.
And so the guy
I think they
says,
said
well,
they beat him. Yeah.
Yeah, they'll beat you. And then the Jewish guy says, well, then, okay, I'll leave Islam. And he says, you can't leave Islam because if you leave, we'll kill you.
Yeah. So, and this was a Muslim speaker bragging to a Muslim audience about how they dupe people into becoming Muslims. Again, this goes straight back to the time of Muhammad. Well, all right. So anyway, we wanted to get through 5 clips from Yusha Evans yesterday. They're all very short, ranging from probably 20 to 50 seconds. But we only got through one because we ended up interacting with a new Muslim friend in the comment section who was calling us liars, and we had a good bit of fun interacting with those comments. But we do want to get through all of these clips of Yusha Evans. Want to get through them, so we're going to go through them kind of rapid fire. I'll play a clip. I'll summarize very quickly what he just said. Anthony can give his response. I'll give any of my additional thoughts, and we'll go on to the next clip. We'll do that just so that we have a full response to this clip and some time to expose everything that Yusha said. So probably won't be interacting much with the chat, but there are plenty of Christians and Muslims over there now to be carrying on a conversation. But let's go ahead and check out the first clip, Anthony. And so this is our first clip of Yusha Evans, where he is asked about the Apostle Paul.
What does Islam say about Apostle Paul?
About what?
Paul. What does
Paul.
Islam
What does
say
Islam
about
say about Paul? Islam doesn't. There's no consensus message about Paul. But let me tell you about Paul. Paul is someone on the day of judgment I don't want to be anywhere near. First and foremost, I want to know what's waiting for him. But Paul is someone who I'm not sure, and no scholar that I've spoken to is sure, what happened with Paul. Was he a saboteur? Was he a saboteur in order to disrupt Christianity or what the followers of Jesus were doing from within? Or was he just fooled by Satan on the road to Damascus when he thought he saw Jesus? That we cannot answer, whether it was blatant or whether he was fooled.
All right, Anthony. So Yusha there is asked about the Apostle Paul. Yusha says he doesn't want to be anywhere near the Apostle Paul on Judgment Day. Fortunately for Yusha, he won't be. Trust us on that one. But he says there's no official Muslim position on the Apostle Paul, although, as we pointed out yesterday, if you go to the early Muslim writings, Muslims during the early centuries of Islam they affirmed Paul as a true disciple of Jesus because they were thinking of certain passages in the Quran which affirmed that Allah was protecting the true followers of Jesus and was helping them against their opposition, so that he even made them victorious over them. That's impossible to believe if you believe that if you say that Paul came in and corrupted Christianity immediately at its origins. So the early Muslims, they would affirm the Apostle Paul as an authoritative disciple of Jesus Christ. Muslims today know more about the teachings of the Apostle Paul. And as I pointed out yesterday, Muslims have to blame the Apostle Paul because he's the only one they can blame, right? If you look at first century Christianity, the followers of Jesus were bowing down and worshiping him as Lord, celebrating his resurrection and proclaiming his death for sins as the only way to have peace with the Father. And if you look back at that, you say that doesn't line up with Islam at all. How is it that the Quran calls Jesus and his followers Muslims? Well, Muslims need someone to blame for getting all of this wrong. So they need a conspiracy theory, a very wild conspiracy theory. Who changed all of the evidence? Who changed all of the teachings of Christ? Who changed all of this? And they need someone in the first century, because we can trace these teachings back to the first century. They can't blame Jesus because Jesus, according to the Quran, was a Muslim. They can't blame Jesus' original apostles because the original apostles are, according to the Quran, devout Muslims. Since they're all Muslims, they can't blame them. Who are they going to blame? Well, they need someone in the first century who was very powerful, but who wasn't Jesus and wasn't one of the original apostles. And the Apostle Paul is the only one they've been able to come up with who could remotely fit into that category. So Islam stands or falls with their condemnation of the Apostle Paul. If they don't have Paul to blame, they have no one to blame for why the life of Jesus, as we read in history, doesn't line up with what Muhammad said. So that's why Muslims have to blame him. But Anthony, Yusha claims that there are one of two options here. You could believe that Paul was a saboteur, or you could believe that he's being deceived by Satan. He was duped by Satan. So Paul's either deliberately deceiving or he was himself deceived, and maybe he believes what he's saying, but he's been deceived. What do you think about those options?
Yeah. So it's interesting. He also said along with that, one thing we do know, whatever option we go with, whether it's he was a saboteur or he was deceived by Satan, one thing we do know is that he destroyed the teachings of Jesus. Now, this creates a number of problems. First of all, in principle, if you believe that God is the one who sent Christ into the world, or if you don't accept the idea of Christ's preexistence, you accept, if you're a Muslim, you believe that he was raised up as the Christ and was sent on his mission by Allah, then you have to believe that Allah failed in the purpose for which he sent Jesus, or that Jesus was a massive failure. Or you have to believe that it was Allah's intention for all of this to go sour, and that creates problems of its own, particularly because the Quran says that Allah promised to be with the followers of Jesus to make them superior and cause them to prevail upon their enemies. So there's a huge problem for Muslims if this is the case, that Paul was able to overcome the true followers of Christ and cause his teaching to trump the teaching of Christ and become the predominant expression of the Christian religion. Now, not only is this a problem just in terms of Islamic thinking, but there's nothing that we can read in the Apostle Paul that we can't see in the teaching of Jesus. Certainly in Paul we find application of Christ's teaching to things beyond the particular circumstances that we find in the Gospels, because Paul is taking the Gospels out into the world, but the message itself is the same. For example, the most important things that Muslims would claim that Paul distorted are, as you've pointed out already in the previous broadcast, the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. All of those things are found in Jesus. In fact, let me just read a few passages. I'll just focus on his death and resurrection. But in Mark chapter 8, it was Jesus himself who said, we're told in Mark 8:31, he began to teach them, the disciples, that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So this is what Jesus taught. Now, Muslims, of course, don't teach that, right? Surah 4:157 is most often taken as a denial of Christ's crucifixion. And if Christ wasn't crucified, then he couldn't have been raised. But Jesus taught this to his disciples, and what's interesting, when you read the whole account in Mark 8 or the parallel in Matthew 16, Peter initially objects to this. He thinks that this is impossible to think of as the way the Messiah would bring redemption and establish his rule. And so Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." The reason this is interesting, of course, is because Jesus identifies as satanic the very opposition of Peter, which is essentially the Islamic view as well, right? And we know that after Christ was raised from the dead, Peter changes his mind, right? We might say that Peter converts from a nascent form of Islam to Christianity. He becomes a true follower of Christ.
But by the way, did everyone catch the importance of that? Jesus says that he's going up to Jerusalem where he's going to be killed. Peter says, "Never, never. God will never let this happen to you." And Jesus' response is, "Get behind me, Satan." So Jesus calls the position that he's not going up to Jerusalem to die satanic, right? It is a satanic. Now, this isn't saying that Satan is speaking through Peter here, as if Satan is trying to oppose the work of Jesus. He just means he's blocking. He's trying to block Jesus. He's in the way. He's opposing Jesus' message and teachings. And Jesus calls it satanic. Well, guess what? Muhammad's objection is exactly the same to that of Peter. This is in the Gospels. Why is this relevant? Well, because Yusha is going to try and pit the Apostle Paul against Jesus, where it's Muhammad who's against Jesus, and it's Jesus who's calling Muhammad's position satanic for standing in opposition to it.
Right. So when you look at for Yusha, the reason for saying these are the two options, he's either a saboteur or he was deceived, is because he's alleging, and he needs it to be the case, that Paul was perverting and purveying a false message regarding Jesus. Once that's taken out, then there's no reason to say these are our two options. Right? There's no reason to limit ourselves to those two options. But in any case, when we look at both of these options, we find that neither one of them are credible when we take into account the evidence. The idea that Paul was a saboteur, that he was somehow trying to undo Christianity by infiltrating it, turns out to be problematic because Paul ends up being too effective. Right, it's similar to when we say logically that a person's argument, if sound, would prove too much, right? It'd prove more than they would want to be the case. Well, in an analogous fashion, the idea that Paul is trying to defend Judaism and sabotage Christianity by coming up with an entirely different message, which he ends up being incredibly effective at disseminating, so much so that it overtakes not only the Christian religion, but the Judaism that he was jealous to defend. That just, the whole idea is just absurd, right? Paul's message, as we pointed out, which is really the same as that of the other apostles, but his message is undeniably the one that comes to be embraced by the Roman Empire and throughout many parts of the world. And so the whole idea of Paul as a saboteur just doesn't work, because remember, he's supposedly sabotaging Christianity because he's jealous to defend the truth of Judaism, which Christianity, in his mind, is corrupting. And so the idea of Paul as a saboteur simply doesn't work. As well, the idea that Paul was simply a deceiver, that doesn't work for a number of reasons. This idea could take one of two forms. He was either a deceiver in the sense that he was, Yusha didn't bring up the idea that he was a deceiver, but a saboteur. The other option is that he was deceived by Satan. And here the problem is that Paul doesn't show any of the marks of somebody who's deceived by Satan. He certainly doesn't disseminate a message that fundamentally, well, first of all, we've already shown it doesn't disagree with the message of Christ himself or with that of the prophets. But it's also not the sort of thing that Satan would be pleased with, right? It's not like Paul taught that men could loot and pillage people and steal their goods. He didn't teach that men could multiply wives or steal women from other people that they've attacked and have relations with slave girls. He didn't teach that you could engage in what is effectively or is basically prostitution, right? Marrying a girl for a few days and then divorcing her just so you could have sex during that time period. But these are all the sorts of things we find in the case of Muhammad. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to look, if you're going to say Paul's a deceiver, you need evidence for it. But we don't find that kind of evidence in the case of Paul. However, we do find that sort of thing in the case of Muhammad. In fact, we find more than that, right? Mm-hmm. We find that Muhammad appears, when you look at the gospel accounts of people being demon-possessed, all of the marks of demon possession are found in the case of Muhammad. When he received his revelations, he would fall to the ground, he would convulse, he would foam at the mouth, his eyes would roll back in his head, he would moan like a camel, we're told in the sources. He'd hear the ringing of bells in his ear or the buzzing of bees. These aren't the descriptions of a man who's receiving revelation. Mm-hmm. These are the descriptions of somebody who's either got a physical malady or he's, demon possessed. Mm-hmm.
And, and if you look at the sort of big events in Muhammad's life, I mean, when he starts receiving his first revelations, he thinks that he's possessed by a jinn and he tries to hurl himself off a cliff. Later you had the incident of the satanic verses where Muhammad was promoting polytheism and said that it's okay to pray to 3 pagan goddesses, and eventually he's called out on it, supposedly by the angel Gabriel, and comes back and says that Satan sort of stepped in during the revelation. So Muhammad's getting a revelation from Gabriel, and Satan is able to slip in there and give him a false revelation. And so, according to that, Muhammad couldn't even tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan, but he admittedly received revelations from the devil. Yusha is here saying, we don't know if Paul may have been deceived by the devil. According to Islam, Muhammad was deceived by the devil. That's according to Muslim sources. Later, he starts walking around having delusional thoughts and false beliefs, and eventually he snaps out of it after a period of somewhere between 6 months and 2 years, and says that a Jewish magician cast a spell on him, giving him these delusional thoughts and false beliefs. So you could actually cast a spell on Muhammad to give him delusional thoughts and false beliefs. So wherever you go, you find evidence that there are spiritual problems with Muhammad. You don't find that with the Apostle Paul, right? The Apostle Paul is casting out demons. So totally different category. All right. So neither. Oh, go ahead.
I'm just thinking. This just occurred to me, but you'll be familiar with the hadith where it refers to the fact that everybody is assigned a jinn, right? And this jinn whispers bad things to him, right? But Muhammad claimed that the jinn that was assigned to him was commanded to be silent or something to that effect, which is interesting now when you think about the fact that Satan's allowed to come along, because Satan is a jinn, right? So Satan is allowed to come along and he's not prevented from duping and deceiving Muhammad, the very person who would have to be protected from Satan. And more than that, since Jibril is supposedly giving the revelation, apparently Satan overpowers him too. He's able to cast his word on Muhammad's tongue, subverting Gabriel's efforts to convey Allah's message.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's go ahead and check out the next clip from our good friend Yusha, and we'll see if he does better here in round 2 than he did in round 1.
That we cannot answer, whether it was blatant or whether he was fooled. But one thing we do know is he destroyed the teachings of Jesus. He told people to break the law. In Galatians, he commanded them to break the law. He said the law is cursed, and Jesus was cursed on behalf of it to remove it from us. And Jesus said anybody who breaks the law and tells someone to break the law, they are the lowest person in the kingdom of heaven.
All right, Anthony. So we had Yusha there giving some clips about Paul ordering his followers to break the law. Jesus said that anyone who breaks the law or orders people to break the law is lowest in the kingdom of heaven. So what do you got here? How are you going to reconcile that? How are you going to reconcile those claims of Paul with the teachings of Jesus?
Yeah. Well, there are several problems here, and hopefully all the Christian listeners are aware of this, and after we speak, the Muslims will be as well. When the New Testament uses the term law, it doesn't always use it in the same way, and this possibly accounts for why some people make mistakes, not mistakes as big or as bad as what we just heard from Yusha Evans, but sometimes people are confused on how the term law is being used. For example, sometimes the word law is just used to refer to the canonical books, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of Moses. And in that sense, the idea that Paul is denigrating or castigating or in any way speaking against the law is patently false, right? Paul, his entire message is that Jesus is the one proclaimed by the law, that Jesus is the one spoken of by Moses and all the other prophets. So the idea that Paul was opposing that can't be the case. But when Yusha says that Paul is telling people to break the law, it seems like he's using the term law in the sense of the commandments of the law. And here again, we still have to make a distinction because there's a difference in the Old Testament between what we would call moral laws and ceremonial laws and even judicial laws. But just working in terms of those first two, Paul most clearly, did not teach that people should break those moral laws that God had given. The moral laws are a reflection of God's own character, which is unchanging. And as a transcription of God's character, the idea that you can violate those and do so with impunity and so forth, that's as contrary to Paul as it is to the entire Old Testament. In fact, let me just, he said, for example, that the law is Paul said, the law is a curse. Let me read to you what Paul actually said about the law, and here specifically speaking of its moral requirements. He says, we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. Here what he's doing is he's making a contrast between the law, which in fact prior to that he says the law is good, right? In fact he goes on to say the law is spiritual, the law is good, and several other positive adjectives to describe the law. But he says the law is good, the law is spiritual. The problem isn't with the law, the problem is with me, right? I'm fallen, I'm sinful, I have a heart that's not fully righteous. And so, and he's not just talking about himself, he's using himself as a representative example of all people. All people by nature are fallen, and so the law is opposed to us in that sense, right? We don't love the law, we don't want to keep the law, we don't have the power to keep the law. And so what Paul's doing here is he's setting up the argument for the necessity of Christ to come into the world and save us, which he explains, he's explained earlier, and he'll explain more in the next chapter. But the point is that Paul is not saying that the law in terms of its moral requirements is bad. He's saying we're bad, and because we're bad, the law is opposed to us. And this is what Paul is developing further in the book of Galatians. When Paul says that everybody is under a curse, he's saying that everybody is cursed by the law because we violated the law, right? Violation of the law necessarily incurs guilt, which brings with it punishment. And so Paul is saying everyone who has not kept the law is under a curse, but Jesus has come into the world in order to take that curse upon himself, which is what he did by dying on the cross. So Yusha has, and I should say further, when Paul says that the law is no longer binding on us, that too has a number of different senses depending on which context you're looking at. But one thing that's clear is that Paul is saying Jesus fulfilled the typological or ceremonial aspects of the law, and we're no longer under those things at the very least, right? We're no longer obligated to go to the temple, perform sacrifices, or observe the dietary restrictions of the Old Testament, and some of the other things that are related to that. But there's no statement, by the way, in Galatians where Paul says the law is a curse. There's no statement in Galatians where Paul says to violate the law, to engage in sin. There's simply none of that in the book of Galatians or anywhere else in Paul.
So we would normally, if some Muslim on the street said that, we might think, here's a person who just doesn't know what he's talking about. But since Yusha claims to really know what he's talking about and to really be an expert on these issues, we have to conclude that he's just making things up and doing so deliberately, right? Because the alternative is ignorant, and Muslims don't want to say that he's ignorant here.
Right.
And so, guys, hope you caught all that. But basically, in effect, if you're talking about the law as the scriptures and so on, or the law and the role that they had, Paul affirms those things. The distinctions that are made in the writings of Paul and in the New Testament in general. One, are you made righteous by the law? Does following the law make you righteous? There, Paul says no. So if you are pursuing the law as a path to being with God for eternity, what was the point of Jesus dying for sins? Right? What's the point? If you can be righteous on your own through the law, why does Jesus die on behalf of sins? And guess what? It's exactly what Jesus said, that he has come to lay down his life as a ransom for many. So that's what Jesus says. So how is Jesus out of line with the Apostle Paul here? And the other thing, as Anthony pointed out, the ceremonial laws, especially if you're talking about Gentiles. Do Gentile believers have to keep the Old Testament dietary laws or these other restrictions? The response is no. What are you talking about? Do you think that by going and doing those things, you're going to be made righteous? That this is how you get close to God? Have you even heard the gospel that was preached by Jesus and his followers? Were you paying attention? So Paul talks about the law in this context. It's not going to get you to heaven. That's not how it works. Jesus died for sins. As far as this meaning that you can go and do whatever you want, that's absolute nonsense. That's a Muslim myth. So we have to give Yusha a couple strikes for this, but it's only going to get worse for him from here on. So let's go ahead and check out the next clip from our former Christian youth minister, Yusha Evans.
So Paul either was a saboteur or he himself was fooled and duped. But even when Paul met the disciples of Jesus, when he met Barnabas, they had a falling out because Barnabas said, hold on a second. What you're teaching is not what I heard from Jesus, and I saw the man myself. Now,
this is just very interesting, especially for those of you who've read the New Testament. He just claimed that Paul had a falling out with the disciples of Jesus, especially Barnabas. And when Barnabas met Paul, heard what he was saying, Barnabas' response was, hey, I knew Jesus. This is not what Jesus taught. Oh, man, matter of fact, let's go ahead and listen to that clip one more time. I want you to, because it's only 20 seconds long. Pay attention to what he says about Paul's falling out with Barnabas and the reason and what Barnabas said, according to Yusha Evans here.
So Paul either was a saboteur or he himself was fooled and duped. But even when Paul met the disciples of Jesus, when he met Barnabas, they had a falling out because Barnabas said, hold on a second. What you're teaching is not what I heard from Jesus, and I saw the man myself.
So, Anthony, Barnabas responded to the Apostle Paul, what you're teaching does not line up with Jesus. I knew the man myself. And so that was the basis of their falling out. Now, Anthony, that's not what I recall reading about the split between Paul and Barnabas at all.
Yeah, not only that, notice that he says this, the way he presents it is, this is Barnabas's initial reaction upon meeting Paul, right? This isn't even something that takes place later. This is their first encounter. But what's interesting is this is from Acts chapter 9, verse 26. This comes after Paul has had his Damascus Road experience. He's been baptized, and other events have taken place. The early Christians had known of Paul as a persecutor, somebody who was violently persecuting Christians, even going throughout the diaspora, the place where Jews had been scattered throughout the empire, and trying to cart off Jewish Christians back to Rome or back to Jerusalem to be tried by the Sanhedrin. So the Jewish Christians are suspicious of Paul at this point, thinking like Yusha Evans, maybe he's trying to infiltrate our ranks so that he might spy out who the believers are, and then basically bring us under trial. But here's what it says in Acts 9 verse 26. When Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple. Now, notice the idea isn't that they're opposed to Paul because Paul's bringing this new message, right? That Jesus was God, that he was crucified and risen. That's not at all what they're bothered by. They're concerned that Paul is coming as a Jew, pretending to be a Christian, and he's going to persecute them. But look at what it says in verse 27. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. And he, meaning Barnabas, he, meaning Paul, declared to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and that he had spoken to him and how he had preached boldly at Damascus in the name of Jesus. So he was with them at Jerusalem, coming in and going out. He was coming in and going out, meaning he was entering in and exiting from the apostles freely. And this is because Barnabas brought him to the apostles and vouched for him. So Barnabas's initial response was not, I saw the man myself. And by the way, notice that actually, Yusha is just so wildly off here. It's just the number of errors is remarkable. I think maybe we should do a show just on who gets the record for being able to cram in the most errors in the shortest space, or who get
Yusuf Estes versus Yusha Evans.
Yeah, versus Zakir Naik with. We could see if we could top Nabil's video.
Yeah.
On Zakir Naik.
25 errors in under 5 minutes. These guys might have that record. And so Yusha just told the Muslim audience that Barnabas's reaction when he meets Paul is, hey, you're teaching all these things that are contrary to Jesus, and I knew Jesus. Hey, what's going on here? When Barnabas is actually the one that brings Paul into the fellowship of the believers, right? Because they're worried that Paul is there to try and maybe come in and kill them because he's a persecutor. And Barnabas is the one who vouches for him, brings him in so that he can enter the Christian fellowship. Very, very different from what Yusha is saying. Now, Anthony, don't Paul and Barnabas end up as companions on their missionary journeys, going around preaching the gospel, starting churches? Don't they end up? It's very strange if Barnabas's first reaction to Paul is, "Way, you're a deceiver. I don't know where you got this stuff from."
Yeah. In fact, Acts 13, if I can pull it up here, shows that Paul and Barnabas were both chosen by the church at Antioch, and I'll just read the verses. But verse 1 says, "Now in the church that was at Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers, including Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul," or Paul. "As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Spirit said, 'Now separate to me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them.' Then, having fasted and prayed and laid hands on them, they sent them away." So now notice this brings in not only that Paul and Barnabas once again are shown to be companions, but it shows that the apostles and the early Christians received Paul, and so much so that they're laying hands on them and saying that the Spirit is the one who's directing them, not only to lay hands on them, but to do so in officially commissioning them to go out and spread the gospel. And so Barnabas is in fundamental agreement with Paul, and so are the early Christians.
Now, we do know that there was eventually a split, right, between Barnabas and the Apostle Paul. But I feel like I remember reading that we know exactly what they split over, and that it's absolutely nothing to do with Paul's views of Jesus. Is this correct?
Yeah. So in Acts 15, we're told that this is long after their missionary journey that we just read about, when they're commissioned by the church at Antioch. sometime during their labors, Mark was involved with them. And for those that don't know, according to Colossians 4:10, Mark was the cousin of Barnabas. So Barnabas and Mark have familial ties. Both, of course, were early Christians. But sometime during their missionary labors, Mark was with them, but had broken off. He didn't continue with them in their missionary labors. And Paul was.
So basically, they're on a missionary journey, which back then was really, really tough, right? You're going on boats, you're going through dangerous regions, people are getting sick, you've got diseases and so on. Eventually, Mark says, I can't go on here, guys, I'm taking off, right?
Right.
In effect.
Right. Yeah. And we don't have all the details of it. There's different possible scenarios that could enter in. But the fact is that Mark, as David said, he doesn't continue with them. And this leaves a sour taste in Paul's mouth, at least. We do know that Paul later reconciles with Mark. So whatever it was, there's a reconciliation between Paul and Mark. But at least at this point, Paul is still a bit upset over this. And when he says, and I'll read, this is in Acts 15, verse 36. It says, "Then after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us now go back and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." So notice, Paul is saying that he, together with Barnabas, had preached the word of the Lord. They preached the same message. And now he's saying to Barnabas, let's go back to these churches that we've already been to and see how they're doing. And then it goes on in verse 37. "Now Barnabas was determined to take with them John, called Mark." So like many Jews in the first century, he had more than one name. Barnabas wants to take John Mark with them. But Paul, verse 38, insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another, and so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, what's interesting here is even though there's this cleavage between them, it's not a separation over matters of faith or when it comes to what God, ethical instruction. They're disagreeing over whether Mark is a reliable person to take with them as they travel back to these churches. But when they do separate, we're told that they were commended by the brethren to the grace of God. So both of them just basically go in different directions to continue the same work that they had been engaged in together previously.
So just to be clear, Paul and Barnabas did have a falling out for a time. We know exactly what the falling out was over, and it's a situation where they're both right? I mean, if you're going on a very dangerous missionary journey, and you can only pick one or two people to join you on your missionary journey, and you're going through some very dangerous areas, and you take someone on one of these trips, and when things get rough, he says, I can't deal with this right now. I have to go. This is too tough for me. And then you have to continue on without him. What should be your response if later on he says, guys, I'm ready now. I want to go with you. Well, you could make a case either way. You could say, no, we should give this guy a second chance. We're going to give this guy a second chance, especially if he's one of your relatives, right? You say, okay, he was a young guy. He's matured a little bit now. Let's forgive him and move on. And let's take him with us. Or you could say, well, look, I have no problem forgiving him, but as far as trusting him to take him along on another dangerous missionary journey where our lives are going to be on the line, where people might stone us to death, do we want to be counting on this guy as our traveling companion? You can make a good case to say, no, there are other Christians that we could take. Let's take someone who's tried and true, not someone who abandoned us last time. You can make a case either way. That's what the dispute was between Paul and Barnabas. Do we take Mark, who abandoned us last time? Do we take him? Barnabas said yes. Paul said no. They said, well, why don't we just make two groups? Barnabas took Mark, Paul took Silas, and you actually ended up with two experienced missionary groups going out preaching the gospel. That is what the dispute was over. What does Yusha Evans tell his Muslim audience was the basis of the dispute? Well, he says, Barnabas saw Paul and he said, oh, you're teaching all these false things about Jesus, and these are just wrong. I knew him, so I got a problem with you. It's absolutely false. It's absolute nonsense. And since he claims that he's read all this stuff, we can only conclude that he is deliberately lying to a Muslim audience. Why? It's the 99-1 rule. Maybe in a room full of 100 Muslims, there's one who's going to go look it up. But if 99 believe you and they think that they know why they reject the Apostle Paul, well, who cares about the one? You've got the 99, right? And so that just seems to be the attitude there. Notice here again, we know exactly what the case is. Yusha Evans makes up a bunch of stuff in order to attack the Apostle Paul. Now, just think about this. If you really had a good case against the Apostle Paul, would you need to make up stuff like this? If Muslims had a real basis for saying this is how we know that Paul was a deceiver, would they need to make stuff up like this? Would they need to say, okay, well, the Apostle Paul and Barnabas had a falling out, they had a disagreement, they went their separate ways over Mark. Let me lie about that and say that it was because Barnabas disagreed with Paul's message about Jesus. Would you need to do that if you actually had a legitimate case against Paul? Of course not. But that's what Muslims do because they don't have a legitimate case against Paul. They have to misrepresent and distort things in order to make their case. All right, well, we have 2 more short clips. Let's go ahead and take a peek at these. Maybe Yusha's going to redeem himself here.
So Paul either was a saboteur or he himself was fooled and duped. But even when Paul met the disciples of Jesus, when he met Barnabas, they had a falling out because Barnabas said, hold on a second. What you're teaching is not what I heard from Jesus, and I saw the man myself.
Oops, I accidentally played the same clip there. Let me go to this next clip. As a matter of fact, I think this next one is just the end here. All right, so last clip, I think.
And he fell out with the other disciples when they got to know him. And Paul, when he returned to Jerusalem, at the last part of his life, Paul returned to Jerusalem. Does anyone know what the city of Jerusalem did? They all came out to kill him. They all came out to kill him. And the guards of Caesar came and got him and protected him and took him away. And that was the end of what we know about Paul. So Paul did not really see eye to eye with the disciples nor the followers of Jesus at any point. It was the later churches and the letters that were written to churches who were outside of Jerusalem, who were outside of the disciples' reach, that Paul had an influence on. But we don't have time for the history of Paul. I wish we did. Paul's an interesting man.
He wishes we had time to really go through the life of the Apostle Paul. I'd be interested in that too. I'd love to see what else Yusha Evans had to say about Paul, because he just gave the highlights there, and in the highlights he got everything wrong. Everything that he said was either a massive misrepresentation or an outright lie. So Anthony, there you have after he mentions the falling out with Barnabas, which he claims was a falling out with Barnabas because Barnabas saw that Paul was teaching all these false things about Jesus. We know it was actually just a disagreement about whether you take a person on a missionary journey after the person has abandoned you on a previous missionary journey. Here he says, and he had a falling out with the other apostles, but then he immediately says, do you know what happened when Paul got to Jerusalem? People came out to kill him. And he makes it sound like these are the followers of Jesus who are coming out, right? Who are coming out to kill this guy, and that Paul has to be protected by the Romans. Now, Anthony, what was Paul's relationship like when he arrives in Jerusalem at the time when people are going to want to kill him? Because Yusha makes it sound like it's the apostles. He had this falling out with the apostles, and that's why people came out to kill Paul. What's the actual case? What happened there?
Yeah, since we only have a few minutes left, I'll just try and do this quickly. Starting in about Acts 21, you have Paul coming to Jerusalem, and the apostles tell Paul, hey, look, the Jews are greatly agitated by you, by the fact that you, like us, are proclaiming Christ, Jesus as the Messiah, claiming that he died for sins and rose again from the dead. And they're saying that in light of that, you're opposing the temple, the law of Moses, the customs, kind of like Yusha Evans is accusing Paul of. But
so just to be clear here, you've pointed out earlier that that when Paul is talking about the law, or when Jesus is talking about the law, or when the first century Christians are talking about the law, they're talking about the law in a lot of different senses, right? They're talking about the law in a lot of different ways. And so the idea is, if you say the law can't do this, like the law can't bring me salvation or something like that, people can misinterpret that to think you mean you're condemning the law in all these other ways or something like that. And that's exactly what Yusha Evans does. But we see that people in the first century did the exact same thing. People misinterpreted Paul. And go ahead and continue.
Well, and you know what's interesting there? This even further proves the consistency of Paul's teaching with that of the apostles and the other Christians and the Lord Jesus. Because remember, when Paul was there, present at Stephen's death, the charge against Stephen was that he was speaking against the temple, speaking against the law, because he proclaimed in Jesus the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. He claimed in Jesus the fulfillment of everything that the temple and everything else stood for. And so this was interpreted by the Sanhedrin as opposition to the law of Moses. But what was it that Jesus was accused of at his trial? Remember, it's the same thing.
He's going to destroy the temple.
He's opposed to the temple and all this stuff. And this, of course, is a misinterpretation of Jesus saying in John 2 that he is the embodiment, the fulfillment of what the temple stood for. Remember in John 2, the Jews come to Jesus and they say, what sign do you show us of your authority? And he says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And they take his teaching that he is the true temple and distort it into a fundamental opposition to the institutions that God had established and so forth, rather than recognizing that what Jesus is saying is, hey, look, guys, this is a visible picture of God's plan. Remember the temple itself. There's a lot that could be said here, but the temple itself was the place where God promised to dwell in the midst of His people. And what the Old and New Testaments tell us is that was a picture of a reality yet greater than that God was directing things toward. And Jesus is claiming to be that reality. He claims to be the embodiment of what the temple stood for. He is God dwelling among us. So in any case, the point is that the Jews interpret Paul's message like the Jews had earlier interpreted Christ's message as an opposition to the teachings of Moses. It wasn't the Jewish Christians who are saying this about Paul. It's not the Jewish Christians that are coming out like a mob to get Paul. The Jewish Christians, the apostles, in fact, try to tell Paul a way that they think will alleviate the false concerns of the Jews. Right? They tell Paul to do several things, to take several steps, so that the Jews will realize, no, Paul is not trying to subvert our customs and the sorts of things that we're suspicious of.
And by the way, that's completely in line with Paul's method, right? To those under the law, I behave as one under the law, right? If he's in different cultural contexts, he's fine with honoring those different cultural contexts. And so the point is, the dispute, nothing in this dispute has anything to do with any of the apostles disagreeing with Paul's message about Jesus. I mean, absolutely nothing, right?
Right.
Well, what are we supposed to conclude? And again, notice what he does. Let me play this clip one last time. He makes it sound like because of the disagreements over Paul's claims about Jesus, people are coming out to kill the Apostle Paul. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one last time, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up.
And he fell out with the other disciples when they got to know him. And Paul, when he returned to Jerusalem, At the last part of his life, Paul returned to Jerusalem. Does anyone know what the city of Jerusalem did? They all came out to kill him. They all came out to kill him. And the guards of Caesar came and got him and protected him and took him away. And that was the end of what we know about Paul. So Paul did not really see eye to eye with the disciples nor the followers of Jesus at any point. It was the later churches and the letters that were written to churches who were outside of Jerusalem, who were outside of the disciples' reach, that Paul had an influence on. But we don't have time for the history of Paul. I wish we did. Paul's an interesting man.
So notice what he said. Notice what he said here, and this is why I pointed out that he's making it sound as if this was the apostles who are in opposition to Paul. He says, and he had a falling out with the other apostles. And when he got to Jerusalem, what happened? Oh, the people of Jerusalem come and attack him to kill him. The Roman soldiers had to rescue him. He said, but it was people outside of Jerusalem. It was people outside of the heart of Christianity. Those people Paul was able to convince to listen to him, but not the people there. So he makes it sound like those people are in complete opposition to him. The early Christians were in complete opposition to him. He doesn't say that it was the people who rejected Jesus who came out, because they're viewing him as a traitor, right? They're viewing him as a traitor to the law and Moses by affirming Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. They're viewing him as a traitor. They're coming out against him. But guess what? That was their same reaction to the other apostles of Jesus and so on. And so, but Anthony, don't we actually know what the reaction of the apostles was to Jesus? How did the apostles react to Jesus? The actual apostles. Paul describes his interactions with the apostles in the book of Galatians, where he goes up to meet them. What happened? Did he go up there and they said, well, Paul, you're teaching a lot of false things. We got a lot of problems with what you're saying. And so we can't have fellowship with you, buddy. You're off limits. We're anathematizing you. What was the reaction?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, though, is that this falls in that same period of time when Paul was working closely with Barnabas, right? In Acts chapter 9, he commends Paul to the apostles. It's later in Acts 15 that you read about the rift over whether they should take Mark with them or not. But there's no rift over the doctrinal issue that was being discussed at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, which is what Paul is referring to in Galatians. In Acts 15 and Galatians, we see that the apostles give Paul the right hand of fellowship, which is a technical idiom referring to the fact that they accepted Paul, embraced Paul, and even endorsed Paul as a witness to Christ's resurrection and a true apostle, and therefore as a spokesman for the Lord Jesus Christ. So the apostles accepted Paul, and the apostles, like you said, also suffered the same kind of opposition by the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, there's some difference there because living in Jerusalem, the apostles would have there wouldn't have been much question about whether or not what to do with these guys in terms of their relation to Jewish customs, right? Mm-hmm. Living in Jerusalem, they weren't in contact with Gentiles all that much, and questions that would have been of concern to Jews wouldn't have really arisen in their case. It wasn't until certain things are very clear to them about what they're saying that the Jews realize they're as much opposed to those apostles as they were to Paul. And that's why we're told that James, the brother of John, in the book of Acts, we're told that they killed him. We're also told that James, the brother of Jesus, was killed by the Jews in AD 62 by the Jews. In fact, the story that's reported in church history is pretty interesting. The Jews respected the brother of Jesus. They considered him a righteous man. And at one point, people were proclaiming Jesus, and they wanted James to go up to the top of the temple and tell the people that what these people are saying is false. But what happens is, this is the tradition. James goes up to the top of the temple and instead proclaims Jesus and says he sees Jesus seated at the right hand of God, just like Stephen did, and then he's thrown from the temple and he's beaten when he falls to the ground. Mm-hmm. Anyways, but the point is that the apostles received the same treatment at the hands of the Jews that Paul did, only in Paul's case, it happens in connection with his Gentile activity, right? He's making efforts to spread the faith among the Gentiles. And this was especially irksome to Jews, because they had long taught that, their customs required an absolute separation between them and Gentiles.
All right, so once again, Yusha Evans has to completely misrepresent and distort things in order to attack the Apostle Paul. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we played his entire response to the Apostle Paul. So he's asked, "What about the Apostle Paul?" His response is, "I don't want to be anywhere near that guy on Judgment Day. Here's why." And everything he then says is either highly misleading or completely false. Why? Why would you have to do that? Well, I have my theory, and my theory is that Muslims do, again, need someone to blame. They have to blame someone for why our records of Jesus don't show him affirming Islam. They show him affirming his death for sins, his resurrection, and his divine nature. That's what we find the early disciples affirming as well. That's what generation after generation after generation of Christians, starting from the time of Jesus, that's what they affirm. But that's not supposed to be the case if these guys were devout Muslims preaching Islam. So you have to blame someone. You need to blame someone. The Apostle Paul is kind of the last guy that Muslims can blame. He's the last, he's all they've got, right? You can't blame Jesus. He was a Muslim, according to Islam. You can't blame his original followers. They were Muslims, according to Islam. So you have to blame someone, and why not blame the Apostle Paul? But there's a problem here. And the problem is, namely, that the Apostle Paul is more reliable and trustworthy than Muhammad in every conceivable way you could compare them. And I did an entire video series on this. Right after we finish broadcasting, I'll post the link to the entire playlist in the comments section. But basically, I went through and I compared Paul and Muhammad in every way I could think of. Every way I could think of these, I could compare these guys. And Paul won. Paul turned out to be more reliable, more trustworthy than Muhammad in every way. Let me just give you the summary real quick. I'll read you the summary, and as far as the full details, you can go ahead and check out that series. So we have much earlier records for Paul's life than for Muhammad's life. Paul was a brilliant scholar. Muhammad was an illiterate 7th century caravan trader. Paul knew the Old Testament backwards and forwards. Muhammad wouldn't know the Old Testament from a phone book. Paul was a contemporary of Jesus. Muhammad was born more than 5 centuries later in a different country. Paul spoke all of the relevant languages for understanding Jesus in the context. Muhammad spoke none of the relevant languages. Jesus sent Paul as an apostle, but condemned Muhammad as a false prophet. Paul tested his revelations. Muhammad didn't test his revelations, even when Allah told him to. Paul's message and authority were confirmed by Jesus' original apostles. Jesus' original apostles condemned Muhammad's teachings as the teachings of an antichrist. Muhammad's other revelations about historical figures destroy his credibility. Paul's don't. The historical method supports Paul's view of Jesus and refutes Muhammad's view of Jesus. Muhammad's teachings were heavily influenced by paganism. Paul's weren't. Muhammad's message flowed directly from his surroundings and his psychological state. Paul's message required a radical transformation. Muhammad lived a morally reprehensible life. Paul didn't. Paul confessed his sins and repented. Muhammad justified his sins and continued in them. Muhammad's revelations were self-serving. Paul's weren't. Paul's revelations made him a better person. Muhammad's revelations made him a worse person. Paul endured greater persecution than Muhammad. Muhammad was spiritually disturbed. Paul wasn't. Paul performed miracles. Muhammad didn't. Paul died an honorable death as a martyr. Muhammad died a disgraceful death as a false prophet. The Quran affirms the reliability of Paul, but Paul condemns Muhammad. Muhammad's message self-destructs. Paul's doesn't. Muhammad's message insults Jesus. Paul's message honors Jesus. Muhammad's message insults God. Paul's message honors God. If any of that's not clear, you have to actually watch the video.
And apart from all of that, there's no problem, right?
Yeah.
If you set that aside, there's.
Yeah, and so notice if you actually line up Paul and Muhammad and compare them and say who's more reliable here, Paul wins in every possible way. And when you put all the reasons together, one side of the scale drops to the floor, right? So that's why Muslims have to misrepresent Paul and lie about him. That's why Muslim apologists have to do this. You can't give an honest portrayal of Paul and then expect people to reject him and to affirm Muhammad. You can't do that. So you have to be dishonest about him, and that's just life. All right. So Anthony, any concluding thoughts here on Yusha Evans and Paul? And then I'm going to take one comment just because someone keeps posting it over and over again, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up.
No, just that Yusha Evans yet again shows that Islamic apologists don't seem to have the same high standards when it comes to critiquing Christianity. Even if Yusha didn't know that what he was saying was false, and I think he does, because there's a lot of reasons to think that he should know it. The fact is he can't possibly know that what he was saying was true, right? There's nothing that would justify saying what he said. So it's obvious that he's either just making it up knowingly, or he's saying things not knowing that it's true or not.
Yeah, so we don't have to say saboteur or duped by Satan. We can say ignorant or deceptive. It's one or the other.
Yeah.
But in either case, whether he's ignorant, he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he's deceptive, he's deliberately misleading people, he does know what he's talking about, but he's a liar, why in the name of common sense would he be your go-to guy to learn about Christianity? He either doesn't know what he's talking, Muslims, he either doesn't know what he's talking about or he's lying. In neither case should you be listening to him. But guess what? That seems to be their favorite kind of person to talk about Christianity. We either want someone who's totally ignorant and just keeps spouting complete nonsense, or we want someone who's lying to us and just keeps spouting complete nonsense. But either way, we want something who's spouting complete nonsense. Under no circumstances do we want someone who's going to tell the truth. Interesting stuff. All right.
All right. What's our question?
All right. Well, I'm saying this because he keeps posting this over and over again, like he's got some awesome objection. Truth alone. And why do these guys always name themselves like Truth Alone or something like this? Right?
they're trying to convince themselves, like Muhammad. You are the prophet of Allah.
Why don't we praise those who killed Jesus for us so that we could have salvation? Now, notice, according to Christianity, the people who crucified Jesus, you had various kinds of groups there. You had the Romans who were crucifying him for political reasons. You had the Jewish leaders who wanted him crucified because of claims that he was making. And but God was using all of this for our salvation. So he says, why don't we praise those who killed him? And he keeps asking this over again. Why aren't you praising them? Why aren't you praising them if that was the means of salvation? Now think about this. So following truth alone's. Oh, go ahead. What is it?
Oh, I'm going to say there's an irony here.
Yeah.
Because remember, Paul says that, when we sin, God is gracious, right? When people turn to the Lord, he's gracious to forgive our sins. And so our sin, ironically, ends up glorifying God. And so Paul says, why don't we say, like some accuse us of saying, why don't we do evil so that good may result? Why don't we do evil so that God will be glorified? And Paul says, God forbid. He uses an especially strong way of denunciating this in the Greek. He says, God forbid that we reason in that way. It's true that God, in his goodness and his sovereignty, is able to bring good out of evil. He's able he's magnified in his graciousness when he forgives our sins. But that's not justification for us to do evil or to say that evil's good. So it's interesting that people who would ridicule Paul would be guilty of the kind of heinous reasoning that Paul condemns. Yeah,
and this is the heinous reasoning right here. Why don't we praise those who killed Jesus for us so that we could have salvation? So think about this reasoning here. If you're walking down the street and some person decides, let's suppose I'm walking down the street and someone decides to kill me. They say, hey, there's David Wood. Let's suppose it's a jihadi, right? And the jihadi says, I'm going to kill David Wood. And he goes and runs me over with his car. But then let's say his insurance company gives me a bunch of money. And I say, oh, well, he got me a bunch of money. Let me praise the jihadi who tried to kill me since I got a lot of money out of it through an insurance company. Does that make sense, ladies? Would I praise him? Would I praise him No. And the reason is when you're judging someone on their motives and intentions, right? It's not just what happens afterwards or what results from their actions. It's what was their intention. If their intention was evil, then you don't praise them, even if something good happens to come out of it. I mean, think about this from an Islamic perspective, right? The pagans of Mecca, after Muhammad spent years mocking their gods, eventually they start persecuting Muhammad. And the persecution gets bad, especially after Muhammad promised to slaughter them. And the persecution gets bad so that Muhammad and his community have to leave the city of Mecca. Well, what happens when they leave the city of Mecca? Well, they go to Medina, where Islam takes on a political role, massively expands, and then they're able to take over Arabia and conquer Mecca. So from an Islamic perspective, the consequences of that decision, of the persecution, namely Muhammad going out and building a political empire. From an Islamic perspective, that was good. In fact, Muslims date their calendar from the time Muhammad leaves Mecca and goes to Medina. That's how significant it was to them. So would you say from an Islamic perspective that since good things resulted from the persecution of Muhammad, therefore we praise people for persecuting Muhammad? We praise the people who persecute Muhammad. We praise people who persecute Muslims. Would any Muslim on the planet make that claim? No, because if you were using it against Islam, they would think that's the most idiotic thing anyone has ever heard. And yet, over and over again, like a beating drum. I mean, how many times has he posted this? Like 30 times, 40 times during this live stream? And previous live streams, I'm assuming? Why don't we praise those who killed Jesus, even though their intentions were to kill him in order to reject the things he said, or kill him out of political expedience? Let's praise them because God used it for good. Absolutely silly reasoning, but what should we even be surprised when we have apologists like Yusha Evans and Yusuf Estes giving these guys their actual thinking about these issues? All right, well, that's about it for this live stream. We wanted to keep this one as short as possible, just so people could just focus on checking out Yusha Evans' claims about the Apostle Paul and see how dreadfully short they fall, and to maybe ask themselves why their apologists are like this, why they end up with apologists who lie to them. And think about the 99-1 rule. Think if that is an accurate way of describing the Islamic apologetics method. I see, Anthony, you got something you want to reply to there.
Well, I don't know if you want Salmon Player's back. He says, David, that's the fallacy of faulty analogy. You can't.
Guys, we've talked repeatedly about here. We've talked repeatedly on here about trying to use fallacies when you don't even know what you're talking about with the fallacies, right? No, you don't know what you're talking about, right? I used a version of a reductio ad absurdum, right? I used a version of that. Namely, I said, here's your reasoning. Now let me show you how it leads to something ridiculous or absurd that you can then see. So you can see how ridiculous or absurd it is, and therefore you're going to hopefully reject your initial claim, right? So the claim is, well, since good resulted, according to Christianity, since good resulted from Jesus' crucifixion, why not praise the people who deliberately and maliciously crucified him, thinking that they were doing evil to him? And all I did was say, okay, if that's your reasoning, let me show you how absurd it is by giving you another scenario, applying the exact same reasoning so that even you guys should see how ridiculous it is. If you're going to say that, then you're going to say, well, God used the persecution of Muhammad by the pagans. He used it for good to establish Islam and make it even more powerful. Therefore, you should praise them for their persecution of Muhammad. Exact same reasoning. Every Muslim here should immediately recognize, oh, that is really stupid reasoning. That is the stupidest reasoning I've ever seen in my life. Therefore, we shouldn't use that against Christianity. But what's the actual response? The actual response is, no, of course that reasoning would be stupid over here, but we don't want to drop any argument against Christianity, no matter how stupid it is. So we want to insist on continuing to use it. So let's just pretend we understand logical fallacies and go from there. All right. Anything else, Anthony?
No, I'm sure he's going to say something, but that could go on ad infinitum.
Yeah, he always does. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us again tonight. We had over 700 people here. It's starting to fall now because I said we're going off right now. But we'll be back this coming week. Sam will be back during the week sometime. Anthony will be back next Friday. So we've got some awesome topics coming up. And again, I've mentioned this before. If you guys have clips from Muslim apologists like this one from Yusha Evans that you'd like us to respond to, in general, the shorter the better. It doesn't have to be 10 seconds, but don't send us like an hour and a half long lecture and say, hey, respond to this. That would take a lot of time to watch it and then figure out exactly what you're wanting to respond to. So if you have short clips, short responses that you'd like us to address or respond to, go ahead and leave those in the comments section, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can in upcoming live streams. Thanks, Anthony, for joining us, and God bless everyone.